discussion on the left, and we generate original policy ideas to build a more equal society. This event is being hosted in partnership with the Labour Movement for Europe and with Progressive Britain as well. And we'll be circulating some links to join each or all of those organisations after the event. You will have just heard that the event is being recorded. It should just be recording the people who are pinned to the screen as speakers at any one point. But if you don't want to be on the recording for any reason, please feel free to turn your camera off, but feel free to leave it on if you would prefer as well. So 5 years ago today, the European Union ratified the withdrawal agreement and Brexit got done. This followed the result of the referendum in 2016 and years of gridlock in Parliament, which was broken by Boris Johnson's victory in the 2019 general election. The advocates of Brexit promised us quite a great significant amount. The UK would be able to strike trade deals with the US and emerging markets, driving growth, whilst also enjoying tariff-free and frictionless trade with Europe. We would get £350 million a week back from Brussels, which we would invest in the NHS. They promised us control over borders and immigration, whilst leaving the Northern Ireland border absolutely unchanged. We would be able to both seize Brexit opportunities, whilst also getting the exact same benefits of being in the EU. So we would have our cake and we would eat it. But things haven't quite turned out as we were promised. We've seen a devastating impact on trade from Brexit, with goods exports to the EU down by £27 billion in 2022 alone, 16,000 businesses stopping exporting to the EU, and a 15% long-term hit to UK trade. Brexit has contributed to stagnating growth since 2016, which has held back living standards and put both our public finances and our public services under growing pressure. And you don't need to just take my word for it. The leader of the opposition herself, a strong advocate of Brexit, recently admitted that the Conservative government had left the European Union before they had a plan for growth outside of the EU. The public can see the impact that Brexit has had, and they know that they were lied to. The referendum was won by a slim majority, but today, by almost a majority of 2-1, Britons think that Brexit was a mistake. However, we remain very polarised, with 2 in 3 Leave voters believing it was right to leave and 9 in 10 Remain voters disagreeing. While there is growing consensus that Brexit has damaged the UK, there's less clarity on where we go from here. So growth, understandably, is the government's driving mission, and a closer relationship with Europe, which reduces friction and supports investment, mobility and trade, could undoubtedly help unlock growth. With Trump back in the White House, a closer strategic relationship with Europe could help increase both our influence and protect our security. And the review of the trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU next year is an opportunity to deliver this closer relationship. But what, as progressives, should we be aiming for, and what should we be advocating for? What sort of relationship would be negotiable with the EU and acceptable to the electorate? And that's what we're here today to discuss. And I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel. We've got Lord Alfdubs, we've got Christabel Cooper, who's the Director of Research at Labour Together, Joel Reland, who is a Senior Researcher at UK and the Changing Europe, Andy Prendergast, who's the National Secretary of the GMB Union, and Stella Creasy MP, the Chair of Labour Movement for Europe. Each speaker will have an initial contribution of about 5 minutes before we have lots of time for you to ask questions and give your views. So first up, I'd like to welcome Lord Dubs for the first contribution. So over to you, Alf.
Right. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me to take part, and congratulations to the people who've organised the event. It is really important. We all suffered because for far too many years, we never talked about the benefits of being in the EU when we were there. We were quite quiet about it, and that contributed to the disaster of the Brexit referendum. I've got one visual aid, and it's today's Daily Express. I wonder whether any of you have seen it. But look, Starmer really can't be trusted with our Brexit, and voters believe PM will squander freedom from the EU. Now, that is what we're up against. Complete and utter fabrication and nonsense. But that's what the popular papers are pumping out, and they contributed to our losing the referendum. What have we seen? What have we seen since the Brexit referendum? We've seen the far right parties resurgent across Europe. whether it's in Germany, Austria, Italy, Hungary was always like that, and many other, and France, many other countries. And I believe that the Brexit referendum contributed to the far-right resurgence, which is a tragedy for Europe. Now, one of the arguments in favor of Brexit was about keep back. We're going to take control, and we're going to control our borders. Of course, that hasn't happened at all. Immigration under the Tories went up to record levels, of which asylum seekers were only a small proportion, so they shouldn't be blamed, even though the many photographs of boats crossing the channel imply that everybody who's contributed to this large number of net immigrants has come across on a boat. So the situation is that we've got the far-right resurgent, and we should not claim to escape that here either. What we've got in this country is of course, reform using the same arguments at the expense of asylum seekers and refugees in a cheap way to get votes, as we've seen the National Front in France, and we've seen it in the countries I've already mentioned. And I'm afraid Brexit has emboldened the far right across Europe, including in this country. Now, what I think we've got to do, given that we can't suddenly go back into the EU, I marched and demonstrated for a second referendum, but I'm afraid that's not where we are now. Where we are now is how we can make good our relationship with the EU, have a positive and constructive relationship, as the chair said in introducing this particular session. And we've got to look at ways in which we are going to cooperate, ways in which we have closer links with our EU partners, closer links with the countries that matter to us so much in terms of trade. And particularly as at the moment, we've got problems coming from Washington. We haven't even got the full measure of the threat that they will pose. But what we've seen is that within the EU, the two strongest countries are now in a weak position. The Germans are having an election, and they're already not showing much strength, and the French are in a weak position. So we, of the major countries in Europe, we are the strongest country. And pity we're not in the EU. We could have far more influence on things. But even so, I think we've got to exert our influence through NATO and through all the other channels that are open to us. I have to say that the party's position on the EU, I would like us to move further down the path towards getting closer to the EU. And I hope it is the government policy we should begin to do that. But I think we've got to do far more by way of increasing the links we have. That will strengthen us as the Labour Party, strengthen the economy of this country, and strengthen us politically, all of which are worthwhile ends in themselves. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for that initial contribution, Alf. So we're next going to be going to Christabel Cooper, who is the Director of Research at the think tank Labour Together, who's going to be talking us through some of the public perceptions to Brexit and the future relationship with Europe. Over to you, Christabel.
Thank you very much. I do have some slides. I don't know if they can be put up. Oh, fantastic. Great. So as Joe and Alf have already alluded to, public opinion has really changed quite dramatically since the referendum in 2016. So we've got a YouGov poll that I think came out yesterday. Only 30% think that it was right for Britain to leave the EU. Meanwhile, we know that British people are not terribly fond of Donald Trump. In fact, a European Council of Foreign Relations poll found that out of all the countries they surveyed, Britain was the least favourable towards Donald Trump. So that's clearly then driving that chart that you see on the right, where you can see that people really do support prioritising Europe over a closer relationship with Europe over a closer relationship with the US. And so against this background, where you've got these kind of figures, where we know that if a referendum was held tomorrow, you'd get majority support to rejoin, why is it that Labour is so reluctant to even talk about this? So if I could have the next slide. Thank you very much. So in the 2024 general election, the crucial voters that handed Labour their majority were the 12% or so of Conservative voters that switched to Labour. 12% doesn't sound like a large number, but it's about the same number of Conservative voters that switched to Labour in the 1997 election. And under a first past the post system, and I'm sure many of you will have their views about the first past the post system, but it is the system that we have, and it's the system the next election will be fought under. Those are going to remain the crucial voters, simply because in the vast majority of seats where the Conservatives are the challenger to Labour, if you take one off the Conservative pile and put one on the Labour pile, that actually counts twice in terms of reducing a majority. So those are going to be the voters that Labour are going to tend to prioritise. And you can see that in 2016, the majority of them voted leave, and today still a larger number of them would still vote to leave the EU, would still vote to stay out of the EU in any kind of second referendum. So it's often said, well, okay, what about all those voters on the progressive side or liberal side of the aisle? People who might be currently voting for the Lib Dems or for Greens, who might be tempted to switch to Labour if Labour took a slightly more pro-European stance. That's probably true, but you know, if you look at what the most important issues are facing the country, what people think are the top issues, Brexit is just coming really quite far down. I've highlighted it in the box there. So this is even for Green and Lib Dem voters. It's just not one of their major priorities that they're choosing to cast their vote on. So from Labour's point of view, they're looking at losing voters to the Conservatives, or indeed to Reform. What worries them is they're going to lose those votes, which count double in many of those seats, and not gain that many from that progressive side, because they're just not prioritising it as an issue. And what we also find is that Leavers, you know, there's still, most of them still do believe that Brexit was, that they would still vote Brexit again. So 22% of them still believe it was a success. 43% think it was neither a success or a failure, and about the fifth of them that think that it was a failure. Most of those think that it wasn't anything inherently to do with Brexit. They think it was that it was poorly implemented. So there's something about people still, quite a lot of Leave voters still remain pretty attached to their Leave vote. So if I can just have the final slide. But yeah, you know, we are in a situation where most people think that Britain's relationship with the EU should change. And that's obviously a huge number. That's 74% amongst those who voted Remain. And we're also in an environment where we have low growth. We know that moving towards customs union, moving towards a single market would undoubtedly help with that. And we've seen in the last week that the government is, you know, it's prepared to pick enemies in order to pursue growth. So, for example, over Heathrow. So it's not out of the question that it could start to look again at some of these options. What I just really wanted to highlight with this last slide, though, is something of a word of caution. So a lot of people voted for Brexit because they wanted to reduce immigration. As Alpha's already pointed out, you know, net migration is now 3 times higher than it was when we left the EU, and people have noticed that. And so I think that there's a broad feeling amongst Leavers that actually leaving the EU didn't do much to help with migration. And hence that kind of explains that graph right at the top right-hand side, which when pollsters put to the public, you know, if the price for a close relationship with the EU was essentially freedom of movement, so it's, you know, EU and UK citizens able to travel, live and work in each other's countries, even a majority of Leavers said they would be prepared to let that happen. As I say, I think that sort of can be explained by the fact that they've just given up on, you know, they've realised that actually the EU was not perhaps responsible for the high levels of migration that they saw. But what was really interesting about that same survey was they asked about the European Court of Justice. And I think this is something that Remainers, and certainly during the referendum, I didn't appreciate until we did some polling afterwards, was just how important this issue of sovereignty is to those who left. It really was a much more important issue than even immigration, the idea that Britain should have control over its own laws. And, you know, we've all listened to the radio programmes where leavers would phone in and the radio host would say, you know, but which law would you change? And they wouldn't be able to say which one they would change. But simply the principle that the Britain should not be subject to a European court genuinely was very important to them. And you can see there that on that graph on the bottom left-hand side, you've still got a vast majority of leavers who would be unhappy about the European Court of Justice having any jurisdiction over British trade or British companies. And if we remember back to when Theresa May's deal came out, a deal that I think most people now think was actually a pretty good one under the circumstances, it was absolutely vilified by leavers. Farage was, you know, absolutely ferocious in saying it was a surrender to Brussels. And you can imagine that if we did move more towards any kind of relationship in which there was a perception that the EU had some kind of control or sovereignty over Britain, Farage would absolutely be back again. He would be delighted. He would be all over the airwaves saying that we've surrendered to Brussels again. So I guess what I would say is that, you know, clearly Britain needs economic growth. If we went back to that chart where you look at Britain's most important issues, their two top issues are the cost of living and the NHS. And basically, in a low growth economy, you can't have both of those things. If you want to have a better NHS, you're going to have to raise taxes, and raising taxes impacts people's cost of living. Really, the only way out of that dilemma is economic growth. So those are the two things that the Labour government are going to have to set it against each other, whether they want to have that fight and make the case this time, because I don't think it was ever really made in the referendum, make the case about sovereignty, make the case that actually, you know, in a world where Donald Trump is actually going to have quite a lot of impact on the British economy, a man that, you know, none of us voted for and most of us really dislike, then, you know, maybe that is a price worth paying for the kind of growth that a closer relationship with Europe can deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christabel. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So our next speaker is Joel Reland. So Joel is a senior researcher at the UK in a Changing Europe think tank. Joel's going to set out some of the options for a closer relationship with Europe and to set out why he thinks that the UK needs a clear strategy on the reset, including a focus on goods trade. So over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Joe, and hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to talk mostly about the policy aspects of the reset and what is available to this government within their famous red lines about no customs union and single market. And so there's a point we made back during the election campaign is there's a great irony to the fact that the government has emphasized the need for growth while ruling out probably the most obvious lever which it has to pull in terms of a much closer European relationship. But that is the reality that we're living in. And so the question is, how do you make the most of the tools that you actually do have in front of you? And I still think there is a case that within the context that we have, the Labour government hasn't been very good at setting out a strategy which can maximise, you know, available options from a closer economic relationship with the EU. If you look at the proposals in the manifesto, they are, you know, quite eclectic, and I would even say incoherent. You've got something around touring artists, something around, you know, professional qualifications. They're not obvious things to pick based on what's available to the government. There's no coherence around a particular economic theme. It doesn't focus just on goods or services. They're not the most obvious low-hanging fruit in terms of being the easiest things to negotiate with the EU. In fact, we know that some of them the EU might even have ruled out already. And they're not kind of, you know, focused, and they're not kind of the most easy, sorry, completely lost my train of thought. But yeah, so they're not kind of easy to deliver either. And so I think there's a need to kind of recoalesce around a more coherent either policy perspective or around feasibility kind of structure. And I would argue that there's a need to focus more on the goods side than the services side of the relationship. So less on those professional qualifications, touring artists, because A, I think that's where more of the economic gain can be had. And B, I think politically, there's more of a dividend in terms of speaking to the kind of political communities which matter to Labour at the next election. Because if we think about the economic costs of Brexit so far, services trade has more or less continued on its pre-Brexit trajectory in terms of growth, whereas goods trade has declined significantly. It's 13% lower in 2022, according to an NSC study, than based on pre-Brexit, and some estimates are now that's even up to 25–30% decrease. The reason for that is because the TCA creates new customs bureaucracy, paperwork, and checks. Services are quite flexible. If you're, a consultant, you can zoom into a call in Amsterdam or Brussels or wherever, and you can still provide your work. You can do lots of things to get around the red tape that Brexit creates. Goods cannot do that. They get stopped at the border, and that creates friction. And that's why you see things like vehicle exports, which are very reliant on the EU market, declining significantly. And also, we are more dependent on the European Union for our goods exports than our services exports. A lot of our services go to the US. It's about a third overall goes to the EU. And again, I think a lot of that's because it's English language. It goes to places like America, whereas goods, half of it goes to the EU. So it's a real market that needs tapping back into. So what can you do? I think there are a number of policies. Some have been raised, some I think still need to be looked at in more detail. So one obvious one is the SPS agreement, which Labour has mooted. That would reduce the amount of paperwork for food and drink exports to the European Union. That has a potential benefit for some sectors and seems an obvious thing to look into. I think probably the most obvious thing to do, which actually came into the news this week as something which is now being discussed, is to link your emissions trading schemes, because if that doesn't happen, what you're going to have from next year is the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism is going to take effect, and that is going to levy tariffs and new paperwork on a wide range of quite critical exports to the EU. So that is a significant bit of future divergence in regulation, which could be avoided through this ETS linkage. Another issue I think would be one which hasn't been raised is mutual recognition of conformity assessments. That means that if you're exporting a manufactured good to the EU, you don't need to get it stamped with a different mark saying it's safe enough for us, and then again, it's safe enough for you, because we have more or less the same regulations anyway. So if you can harmonize how that's done, that reduces friction. A fourth one would be this PEM agreement, which we've heard a bit about. I don't think it's economically radical in terms of what it's going to do, and would only help a few select industries, but at the same time, it is slightly beneficial and therefore not to be sniffed at, especially when we're in the process of just trying to restart a closer economic relationship. I don't think there's a reason to look away from even quite marginal gains that you can get, also because it kind of sends a message to the EU about your willingness to work constructively on reducing trade friction. So I think there's benefit to that. And finally, I would say the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, which is going through Parliament, and theoretically gives the government quite significant powers to align with future EU regulation on product standards in particular, is potentially quite an effective way to avoid that future divergence where the EU changes regulations, we don't, and therefore there's new customs regulatory friction at the border when you're exporting. So thinking strategically about how you use that, I think, would be a final key task for the government. And just to conclude, I guess, to kind of offer something maybe slightly more ambitious, more of a, maybe, you might say stretch goal in policy terms, is, because ultimately, what is this building towards? You're trying to sort of chip away at frictions in the relationship, but have you got a longer term vision of where you want to go? I'm not sure the government does yet, but for a pro-European caucus within the party, if you're thinking about a realistic objective that you can push, I would say a customs union is something to maybe be thinking about in the sort of middle distance. I know the government says they've ruled out rejoining the customs union, but frankly, no one can join the customs union without also being in the single market. It's like, saying we're not going to rejoin the EU wholesale. Whereas a customs union is something which is potentially more viable. The EU has a customs union with Turkey. It has its downsides, but it does reduce a lot of the trade friction around goods. And also, if you go back to Theresa May's withdrawal agreement in 2018, there was quite an ambitious plan for a customs partnership in there, which the EU was signed up to in principle and potentially serves as a template for, again, facilitating your goods trade in future. It doesn't raise as many complex questions about sovereignty as rejoining the single market. There are questions about, you lose some control of your trade policy, but I'm not sure that's quite as sensitive an issue in the way that Christabel was alluding to before. I think it's more about control of regulations than trade. I will certainly say I think it's not that politically likely based on where this government is, but I think it's something to be thinking about in the longer term, and I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Joel. That was fantastic. Our next speaker is Andy Prendergast, and Andy is the National Secretary of the GMB Union, where I believe he leads on representing workers in the private sector. Andy is going to explain the impact of Brexit on trade and supply chains and on members in the GMB, and a bit about where we might want to look at going from here. So over to you, Andy.
Great, thanks, Joe, and welcome everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak. Look, my union, we're quite open. You know, we campaigned for what we called an angry Remain, and the reason it was an angry Remain is because I think sometimes the debate on Europe became very polarised. Well, I've very rarely come across anything as polarised, but I think too often we were put in a situation where we were either expected to say the EU was the best thing since sliced bread, or frankly, it was terrible. And I think for many of us, you know, the EU is and was an imperfect organisation, like most organisations are. But what we saw overwhelmingly were the benefits. But when the result came, I think like many of us, while we were sort of shocked and worried, it was that opportunity to see what exactly would happen. And ever since then, we've been taking stock. And we've done a number of surveys of our reps, particularly in manufacturing, which is a big exporting area. And the results of that are stark. You know, 51% of our manufacturing reps said Brexit makes it significantly harder to do business. You know, along the issues we picked up were delayed deliveries, having to fill out huge amounts of customs declarations, more red tape, more checks, higher prices, problems sourcing chemicals, parts, increased transport costs. And these are ones that were felt right over all industries. And when you look at the cost of these, you know, customs alone is estimated to cost £7.5 billion a year in additional checks that are borne by British businesses. And what I think is interesting about that figure is that we currently have something of a hysterical debate about the Employment Rights Bill and the alleged cost that this is going to add to businesses. Now, I think firstly, what I would say is a lot of these figures seem to be plucked out of the air by doom mongers, and they focus exclusively on the costs with none of the benefits. For example, the right of union access, having someone like me come and sit in your canteen for 2 hours is going to cost you no more than a couple of cups of tea. So I don't see some of the multi-billion-pound price tags attached to it. But if you take, you know, even the most hysterical figure, which is £5 billion, that's a fraction of the amount that custom checks alone have added to business. And what is absolutely astonishing is that the people concerned about red tape, the people concerned about cost of businesses, are the ones almost exclusively who've been pushing through Brexit. We see it particularly in an area like chemicals, where we've had to effectively recreate the REACH programme, a very successful European standard programme, and that alone costs somewhere in a region of £3 billion a year in the chemicals industry. Now, some people point out, and it's true, that our chemicals exports have actually gone up. They've gone up by 2% over the last 5 years. The problem is if you look at Europe, the average European country's chemicals exports have gone up by 25%. So what we're seeing is not only huge areas where our economy is being hit, but also where we're not taking the advantages of additional trade. And we're also seeing it in the area of workers' rights. You know, the deal we got, the alleged oven-ready deal, which turned out not to be an oven-ready deal, includes something about the level playing field. But a level playing field did not stop one of the biggest attacks in employment rights in 10 years, which was the frankly ridiculous minimum service levels bill. This was the one that mandated unions to provide minimum services in disputes, normally in areas where we already did provide minimum service levels in disputes, like places like ambulances and the NHS. So from our point as a union, you know, what we need is we need to increase trade. We need to increase economic activity. We've had now 15 years of absolutely anemic growth, which is only as a result of a rising population. Living standards have fallen, and we need to make exporting easier. You know, we need to bring back supply chains. We need to look at new technologies. And the only way we're going to deal with new technologies is being able to export. Britain on its own is not enough large enough market. So we need a new deal with the EU, because when you look at it, you know, we were told that freeing ourselves with the EU would suddenly make us Singapore in the North Sea. It would have all of these benefits. But as we sit here today, you know, for all of the fanfare, no significant new markets have opened up. No significant new treaties have been signed. And the golden prize, which we were told by the likes of Farage we would get, a trade deal with the US, looks further away than ever. And if anything, we're now looking at not free trade, we're looking at significant tariffs. So from our point of view, we need to get a new deal very quickly. And like Joel, there's various ways this can be done. The EU has shown itself flexible with Norway, flexible with Switzerland, flexible with Turkey. There is scope for an economy the size of ours to negotiate a bespoke agreement which works for us and which works for the EU. And what I would also say with that is when we go back to the EU debates, we have to remember how the goalposts continually changed. I remember Nigel Farage saying a Norwegian deal was acceptable. I remember Nigel Farage telling us that the German car industry would never allow Brexit to happen. None of that happened. So we actually now have to confront the liars, confront the charlatans, and sit there and say, the problem with Brexit wasn't how it was handled. It was that the idea was absolutely false in the first place. We have left one of the biggest markets in the world to stand on our own in a world that's becoming increasingly isolationist, and it simply isn't going to work. So we need to go back to the EU. We need to get a deal. We need to look at things like Erasmus, things like workers' rights, things like better standards that actually will help people, help our exports, and put money and jobs back in the pockets of British workers. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andy. So we're just coming up to our final speaker for the initial contributions. And after this, we'll be inviting everyone here to put your questions to the panel and to make any points you would like to. So please have a think about what questions you might want to be asking. But I'm now going to welcoming Stella Creasy MP. So Stella is the Member of Parliament for Walthamstow and also the Chair of the Labour Movement for Europe, which is one of the co-hosts and organisers for the event today. So thank you very much, Stella, and over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to all of the other speakers. I suspect that many people listening this evening will be thinking, well, I know all of this. We know that Brexit has not been what was promised. And can I give a big warm welcome to anybody here from Guido Fawkes, who may well be listening in, who wants to think otherwise. I hope that what you've heard so far from the speakers has been a sharp wake-up call about the damage that Brexit has done. So let me speak, therefore, to the people in the audience who would like to think it would be easy to undo Brexit. Let me start by saying, as Alpha said, that rejoin is not on the cards, and we as the Labour Movement for Europe are not campaigning to rejoin the European Union because you can't make Brexit work. Now, that may seem an odd sentence to say, so let me unpack that for you. We believe we've probably got about 18 months to do a salvage operation to save the jobs for the workers that people like Andy represent. That means that we have to, first and foremost, reclaim the mantle of acting in the British interests. And the interests of the British economy are about growth. They are absolutely about the things that Rachel Reeves has been talking about, and the need to prioritise what we can do in the next 18 months to prevent any more investment, any more jobs from being lost as a direct result of Brexit. That is not entering into substantial and lengthy treaty negotiations. So I want to be clear with this audience tonight that we in the Labour Movement for Europe want to reclaim from Nigel Farage the patriotic argument and say that we, those people who knew that Brexit wasn't going to be a good idea, are the true ones fighting for the British interest in this fight, and therefore set out what those things might be. Now, there is much for those of us who are passionate about what opportunities lie in our relationship with Europe to be excited about. There is going to be a summit next week. Clearly, our relationship with Europe is back on the political agenda. Anybody who doubts that only has to think back, what, 18 months ago when we sent a prime minister to Europe who couldn't decide whether the French were friend or foe. It is absolutely a sea change in the approach. And equally, it is vital that we are fighting for the things that can be achieved so that we can show people the benefits of cooperation with Europe within that time frame. What do I mean by that? It is incredibly welcome that the government has started to talk about the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention. I'm more hopeful than Joel that it will have an impact, because I think if you put that alongside an SPS deal, then for many of those people in our food supply chains, it could be revolutionary. The Pan-European Mediterranean Convention already exists. We were part of it before we left the European Union. It's broader than the European Union. Many North African countries are part of it. But frankly, what it does is reduce paperwork. And if we are anything on the left, we should be the Reds against red tape. The red tape that came as a result of Brexit is crippling small and medium-sized enterprises in this country. And you can see that firsthand at the borders. Go to Sevington, see the queues of lorries, see the amount of paperwork that, because we don't have those shared pieces of legislation around rules of origin that PEM would generate, our small businesses have basically given up on even being able to compile to be able to import. If you put PEM alongside an SPS deal, you can transform our supply chains, which is absolutely crucial, not just for our food supply industries, but also for our motor industry, anything where there is a just-in-time supply chain. So fighting for PEM in the coming months is an absolute priority for all of us. So too is a youth mobility deal. Now, I saw in the comments some people talking about, well, this is really a litmus test from the European Union, and that is fair to say, because they recognised the last government was using youth mobility because it was trying to negotiate individual deals with various different countries as a way of undermining the way in which the European Union works in tandem. We should not do that. We should take at face value the opportunity of a youth mobility deal and ask what is in the best interest of British workers. Let me be clear, what was being proposed last year was not in the best interest of British workers. It was 4 years to one country. I think most of us can recognise that the value of being able to travel around a number of countries, that the problems people are having with the 180-day rule come from the ability to cross multiple borders. But we absolutely should sit around a table and negotiate a youth mobility deal and use that as a template for what else we can do to reduce the problems the visa situation has created, not just for our creatives, but also for those people in professional services. Joel is also right to look at the product regulation bill. And right now, the bill is going through the House of Lords, where there is an amendment that we in the Labour Movement for Europe have been helping to craft about looking at this issue of alignment. Nothing gave me a greater sense of irony as somebody who was passionate about staying in the European Union than sitting on the Statutory Instrument Committee last year as the government graciously admitted that if you had met European standards, we would judge you to have met British standards. Because the reality was, it meant after 5 years of telling us that what we wanted to do was go it alone and have our own standards regime in this country, it was too expensive, too complicated, and too much red tape for British business. We've got to show British businesses that we understand paperwork is one of the problems that they've got. Multiple regulatory regimes are not in their interests. So we need to strengthen the product regulation bill to make it clear that there would only be incredibly exceptional circumstances when we would differ from European regulations, and that crucially there would be democratic control over that. It's right too that we're looking at defence and security, but I think we on the left also recognise you need to put the climate in there. That's why Joel is right about CBAM. We must decarbonise our industries, but we must make sure that we don't become a dumping ground for Chinese steel, which is why we need to be part of the CBAM mechanism, and also why we should join the North Sea Energy Cooperative, so that we can together invest in tidal energy and help cut our energy bills. All of these are matters that could be part of a conversation for the next 18 months, giving British businesses hope. They haven't just got a government that gets it, we've got a government that gets on with it. But I also urge all of you who are progressives to be focused on those 18 months and what can be done, because frankly, there's a real risk here, and I will finish with this. We know that circumstances have changed substantially, not just in Europe, where obviously we've seen the rise of the far right, not just in President Trump, but also in the willingness and patience that people have for the negotiations that need to happen. We must use that opportunity, and we must show our colleagues in Europe that we understand the value of collaboration, because they too face these challenges alone. Sometimes the debate in the United Kingdom appears to act as if our colleagues in Europe have just been waiting for us to realise that we've made a mistake and to come to them. We have to act in mutual interest, which means we have to recognise what mutual interest is. Our colleagues in Europe are also concerned about tariffs. They are also concerned about Putin, about what happens, hopefully, if the ceasefire holds in Israel and Palestine. If we act as if we're not sure if we want to debate and negotiate with Europe, or we want to go with America, there's a very real risk that neither will talk to us about anything substantial. And all the opportunities that are now starting to unfold because we've got a government of grown-ups could be gone. So I urge everybody on this call, however frustrated you are, that we knew in 2016 and we knew in 2019 that Brexit would not end well. The fight is for 2025 and what could happen next. The stakes have never been higher, but neither have the opportunities as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. So we are now at the point where we can invite contributions and questions from attendees. So feel free either to stick up your hand, your virtual hand, which I believe you should be able to do through the more button. Sorry, we've got an additional guest here. Or if you would like to, you can put your question in the meeting chat, and I will try and read it out. If you could keep them relatively concise, that would be great, so we can get as many people in as possible in the next half hour. So I'll go straight to Peter Cook, if that's okay.
Yes, unmute. Right, we're there. Sorry. Am I? Can you hear me now? Right. Okay, you've done it. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can, yes, thank you.
You can, okay. Thank you very much. That was a very good, enlivening discussion. Much better, I have to say, than UK and Changing Europe on Tuesday. So I really enjoyed it. To the question, I stood a candidate in the 2024 election against Nashuba Khan. I say against because I actually supported her several times at hustings in order to make sure the Tories were out, which was a noble ambition. Not many politicians ask people to vote for other people. But during that debate, the only thing we clashed on, we didn't even clash. She said, you know, Brexit was not mentioned on the doorstep. And I said to her, you're absolutely right. It wasn't, because Labour and Conservative moved it out of the Overton window. But then I went on to say, of course, the NHS, cost of living, all the things we are concerned about and were at the front of people's noses and minds were mentioned on the doorstep. And all of them have at least one foot in Brexit, or, you know, perhaps Ukraine being the slightly different one. So to sort of say that the elephant in the room is not relevant now is disingenuous, at least I would say. So would you like to comment on any of that? So I know it's not really a comment or a question, but you know, we're living with the children, the offspring of Brexit, and it won't go away by a death by 1,000 ameliorations, which seems to be the current. I encourage you to have courage, please. That's it.
Thank you, Peter. I'll take a couple of questions each time, and it'd be good to get some gender balance as well. But as the new General Secretary of the Fabian Society, I will go next to Fabian Breckles, if that's okay. And I hope, Fabian, that you are a member of the Fabian Society, fingers crossed.
Not as yet, but I can always re-look at that. Anyway, my concern is, first of all, I'm concerned about Labour's stubbornness over the red lines, you know, no custom and all, and you know, which I think, you know, now that Trump's been re-elected, we should be revisiting. But another thing that I'm concerned, and it's not just about the Brexit thing, I think it's about absolutely everything Labour tries to do. We have foreign-owned media like the Express, like the Mail, owned by you know, tax exiles at best, absolutely trashing everything we do. We need to get a grasp of that. We need to get rid of foreign media ownership. We need to be looking at Australia's introduced a cap on the amount of foreign money that could come into elections. We need to do that so we can stop, you know, Trump's acolytes trying to buy the next election. And I'm really, you know, frustrated that we seem to be having 12% of the electorate, you know, 12% of the, you know, the 12% Tory voters who came over to us, they seem to have the whole country by the short and curlies, and we can't actually deal with the elephant in the room. I take Stella Creasy's point that we've got to focus right now on what we can do in the next 18 months to stop the economy tanking and to save jobs and to cut the paperwork. I get that. But I think we need to be looking, you know, we need to be much more open to, you know, freedom of movement, customs union, single market, but also we've got to handle the messaging, and we've got to deal with the hostile messaging and the fact that we've got foreign-owned hostile media. We ought to be able to deal with that by insisting that you can't run a British paper or news site unless you actually live in and pay taxes in this country. Simple thing to do, surely.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Fabian. And I'll just come to Carol, if that's okay, before we go back out to the panelists for some reflections. Carol?
Hi.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, Carol Tongue. Enormous benefit to the UK would come from rejoining Creative Europe in terms of benefit to the creative industries, which the government constantly says is one of its growth sectors of the economy. And yet yesterday, the Conservative, and I underline the word Conservative, chair of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, Carolyn Dinenage, asked Sir Chris Bryant, Minister of State, about joining Creative Europe to benefit our film and television industry, where the whole industry, according to the BFI, is in favour. And yet Bryant replied, there isn't even a table. I find this, incredibly disappointing, and I'd be interested to hear the reaction from our panelists as how you move forward on something like this, which is so important to one of our most important industries, particularly from a growth and cultural and societal point of view.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Carol. So 3 questions there. One about, whilst Brexit isn't necessarily at the top of the list in terms of people's priorities, the things at the top of the list are inextricably related to the impact of Brexit. So how do we draw those lines, and how do we address the kind of voters' priorities through a closer relationship with Europe? Fabian's question about how do we address or what role does the Eurosceptic press play in this debate and in terms of how we move things forward? And then finally, that really important question from Carol about the impact on the creative industries. I'll go in reverse if that's okay. Stella, do you want to address any of those 3 initial questions?
Yes, I will. Let me try and draw them all together, because I absolutely dispute Peter's suggestion that we're not having courage. I think courage is to be focused on fact and reality, because I think all of us can agree with some of the mythical flights of fantasy. And I say this as somebody who last week debated whether Brexit had been a good idea with Claire Fox and Marc Francois, that fact and reality are really important in this. I also, and I've been clear, I think we should stop talking about red lines because the circumstances have changed, and we should be approaching our European colleagues. I don't know whether Andy would agree with this in terms of negotiations. If you walk in the room and the first thing you say is, I don't want this and I don't want that, you close down the opportunity to look at what else could be on offer. That doesn't mean that we have to take it, but I think we do need to talk in this changing circumstance about what is possible. So I want us to move away from talking about red lines and start talking about our mutual interests on trade. Carol is right about our mutual interests in the creative industry, in an environment where we are looking at what we export. Obviously, our services in creative works as well as our goods. I know that a lot of people are moving, not just the performers, but also the ability to create the technical staff. The technical training is moving overseas slowly but surely. So Peter, I don't think that we're not having courage. I think the courage is to recognise that going round and round and having the same debates of 2016 and 2019 is not going to shift the dial that we need to shift, that actually all is not lost. I wouldn't do this role. I wouldn't be here as chair of the Labour Movement for Europe, not just because I get the chance to hang out with Neil Kinnock, which my 15-year-old self still adores, but because we are both focused on the fact that it is possible to salvage something. But if you're going to do that, the courage is in being clear about what the problems are and what the chances are. The idea that we could just walk back to Europe and say, look, we've caused all this damage, all this mess, all this disruption. We're still quite a divided country about it, but hey, you're going to give us more time and effort, when they've got to deal with the challenges of climate change, when they've got to deal with the challenges of energy security, isn't possible. But we've all got to deal with energy security. We've all got to deal with Putin. We've all got to deal with the possibility of tariffs. That is a much more hopeful, courageous conversation to have, and it's not one shaped by red lines. It's shaped by mutual interests. So, and I would add creators into that, Carol. So I think I dispute your idea that we're not being courageous. I think we are being courageous because we're being clear.
Thank you very much, Stella. Christabel, would you like to come back on that question about the public's priorities, whether Brexit's one of them, and the relationship between Brexit and the things which do come at the top of the priorities?
Yeah, no, thank you, Joe. I mean, I think we know that the reality is that, you know, as every sort of sane economist has pointed out, that the lack of growth engendered by Brexit has contributed to both, well, certainly to you know, the lack of tax revenue, which has then contributed to the lack of funding in public services and necessitated the Conservatives having to raise taxes to unprecedentedly high levels. So I think we know that in reality, Brexit was one of the contributors to that. But the problem is that I don't think voters necessarily, or not many voters, see it that way. Certainly the half that voted Leave wouldn't see it like that. But I mean, I guess I just go back to sort of what I said in my contribution, though, is that I think the Labour government is going to be judged on those two things. And so whether or not it kind of directly says, well, you know, we're going to move closer to the European Union because we want to do something about the cost of living in the NHS. I don't think it matters. It's whether actually that Labour government delivers on those two things. And if moving to a closer relationship with the EU is what contributes to that, then I think that that's something that they should really seriously consider doing.
Thank you very much, Christabel. And Joel, did you want to come back on any of those three questions?
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief. I think there's a point which needs to be made, which is that, you know, for a discussion which is about Europe, there's been remarkably little mention, and I include myself in this, of Europe so far in the course of this debate. We're talking a lot about what the UK would like and kind of, you know, the vast menu of options which might be available to us, but we need to think about what the European Union is going to accept. And as Stella says, they have a long list of priorities which are much, much higher than rebuilding the UK relationship. And to be quite frank, there's also an incentive for Brexit not to work too well for us. Obviously, they want constructive relations. They want to cooperate on the issues that really matter. But Brexit has worked in the sense that since the UK left, active Euroscepticism for leaving the EU from other member states has died because they've seen what a mess it becomes and how difficult it is to process. So there are real limitations to what the EU is going to be willing to offer. And I would just counsel that when you think about how you approach a negotiation, it's about balancing your interests with the objectives of the other side, offering things which they want, which are youth mobility and fish, and maybe a bit of defence as well, and not over asking. So I think this reaching for everything available, trying to go too far, is a mistake. And the real challenge for the Labour reset is making sure you select the 3 or 4 issues which matter most to you, which join up together and which can be logically traded off for something on the other side with the EU. And that's how you're actually going to make progress. The EU is a vastly experienced negotiating machine. It's been doing it for decades. And if you come in all guns blazing, you know, you're going to run out of bullets very quickly and be left with nothing.
Thanks very much, Joel. Andy or Alf, would you like to come back on any of those initial questions, or should we go out for some more questions?
Look, I'm happy to come in, and look, I forgot the gentleman's name, but I think there was one thing about, you know, the negative media, and I think, look, on the left and as a socialist, we've had negative media as long as we've had socialism. You know, you go back to 1945, Churchill was telling everyone, if you vote Labour, you'll get the Gestapo. You know, you go back to the 20s and the Zinoviev letter. We have always had this. I think the one thing we have to recognise, though, is that they have become far more effective at messaging than we have. A lot of that based on blind dishonesty. You know, they have a system of telling everyone what they want to hear. I mean, one thing that, having done a lot of work in a referendum that I never knew, was there was a very successful campaign, but ironically launched by people who want to bring back fox hunting with animal rights people, that leaving the EU would be good for animal rights because the Spanish do bullfighting. So we have to get 10 times better than the messaging. And I just want to follow on one thing that Stella said. You know, my job is to negotiate, often under very difficult circumstances. And one thing that really hit me about the media portrayal of negotiations is the way that the media don't seem able to treat people like adults. You know, when we put in a pay claim, I have members who are illiterate who understand that, you know, when you're asked for 5%, you might get 4%. And yet, when we came to the European negotiations, no one seemed to be able to understand that this was going to be a bit of a give and take, that we weren't going to get everything we wanted, but hopefully we're going to get a lot of what we wanted, and some things we were probably going to have to not reject or take as part of a deal with holding your nose. So I think we just have to have a more grown-up debate about it. We have to identify what the priorities are and understand that we're not going to get necessarily everything, but overwhelmingly we should be able to get a deal that benefits the most people. And I think just following on from the last speaker, the other thing we have to recognise as well, and I think this is quite important, is that the EU itself is changing. And frankly, an EU dominated by left and centre governments was a far more attractive prospect than an EU dominated by far right ones. And I actually think, from the point of view of being a progressive, Europe needs us at the moment as much as we need them. Because if we have a sort of centrist, centre-left coalition, we can do great things in Europe. Otherwise, we're just going to see the far right get stronger and stronger. And they're already looking like they're going to take a majority before too long. We've got German elections, French elections, both of them in the balance. And that could create some real difficulties. But it still means we need a good trade agreement. It still means we can get better workers' rights. And we just have to be honest with people about what is possible. And if we move forward on that, there's a better deal to be had.
Thank you very much, Andy. Alf, did you want to come back?
Very briefly, yes. I very much agree with what Andy's just said. Can I just support Carol Tung's comment about Creative Europe? We have, after all, the most powerful creative industry in Europe, and yet we're selling it short, but not giving them the opportunities that they ought to have. And next, I remember when we were in the EU, there was hardly any publicity about EU membership in this country. I travelled from Northern Ireland to the Republic, full of EU banners, thanks to the EU, thanks this, as in every other country. We never did that. So there was a blank there. There was a default position, and we didn't do it. And if we're going to move closer to the EU, then we've simply got to get public opinion more positively on side. I appreciate Christabel's charts, but we've got to get a more positive sense that the EU matters, because otherwise we're going to find it hard politically to move in that direction.
Thank you very much, Alf. I think we'll try and get at least one more round in of questions. Elizabeth, you've got your hand up. So if we could go to Elizabeth and then Mickey, please.
Yes, hello. Thanks very much. My question really is about the youth mobility scheme. I think one of the enormous tragedies of leaving the EU, apart from the economic effects, was the loss of mobility for our young people and for European young people to work and live and study and travel in all our neighbourhood countries. And the EU recently offered us the Erasmus Plus scheme, and the Labour Party turned it down, and I really cannot understand why that happened. Maybe somebody can explain that to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Can we go to Mickey and then Danny, please?
Yeah, thanks. I think my question is really this: why have the Labour Party... Sorry, can you hear me?
We can, yeah, go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah. Why have the Labour Party got these red lines that they'll not join the customs union and the single market? I mean, where are these red lines coming from? Because the Brexit referendum only asked, do we want to leave the EU or not? But it didn't actually say what type of Brexit we're going to have, and that was left completely open. And I recall during the referendum, many prominent Brexiteers mentioned doing a deal like Norway or Switzerland. I mean, I think there was a meme with Farage mentioning Norway like 20 times in a small clip. And people also, some of the leading Brexiteers even said that no one's talking about leaving the single market. So it seems to me that leaving the single market was a political choice, but it wasn't actually one demanded by the referendum. And so given this very close result of 48 to 52, clearly the population wanted a really soft Brexit. And had we stayed in the single market, we would have got a soft Brexit, which was actually more in line with what the referendum result was. So given that there's never been a mandate for leaving the single market or customs union, and Brexit is costing the UK, what's it, about 4% of GDP, according to the OBR, and a 15% drop in trade intensity. As Rachel Reeves and Labour desperately want growth, why can't we simply join the single market and custom union? And really, at a stroke, we would get growth as well as strengthen the pound and reduce inflation. I should say I feel quite strongly about this. I've created a petition as well on this. I've posted on the thing. But to me, it just seems a political choice, and I don't understand where they come from, these red lines.
Thanks very much, Mickey. I'm guessing that in this case with the red lines, we're referring to the kind of things set out in Labour's manifesto, which, but obviously those were kind of political choices at the time. But it'd be good to get the speakers' views on that, and we'll just come to Danny now, if that's okay. And if there's any more, I want to get some gender balance to the question. So any more women who want to raise some questions or make some points, please do come in. But over to you, Danny, please.
Okay, the first part of my question is really probably for Christabel. We know that there are big majorities in the polls who say that the public think that Brexit was a mistake, but has there been any polling to find out what the appetite would be for another referendum and a protracted round of negotiations to rejoin, assuming the referendum was passed? Because I suspect the answer would be a lot less favourable. And then the second part of my question is really for everyone on the panel, that I don't see that the EU will ever want us back until they think there is a consensus within the country and amongst the political parties to rejoin. And what can we do to build that political consensus, including with conservative Remainers, who are still a sizable section of the Conservative vote?
Thank you very much. Excellent questions, Danny. I'm afraid we're going to have to go back to the panel now because we've got just 10 minutes left. But if I'm afraid if I wasn't able to come to you, if you could pop your questions in the chat or contact some of the speakers, I'm sure they'd be happy to discuss them. That question from Danny was aimed at you, Christabel, the initial one at least. I guess your views on what's the public's perception of another referendum. How popular is that? And I guess what are the alternative options for getting democratic consent on a significant change in the relationship with Europe? So over to you, Christabel.
Thank you. So I just very quickly looked that up, and actually, so I can find YouGov poll in 2023 saying by 46% to 36%, Britons say there should be another EU referendum within the next 10 years, which actually I'm surprised that it was that positive. I guess what I would caution is, I think we all remember just the level of rancor, the level of chaos that the Brexit wars brought to our politics and to our society during that time. I do wonder whether there is a tolerance for going back into that kind of divisiveness again. Certainly when we went into the 2019 general election, you know, a lot of people said, well, a majority of people voted for parties that would have backed a second referendum, but there was never a majority for a second referendum. There was certainly a number of people who would have voted Remain, but in an ideal world would not have had a second referendum simply because they wanted to avoid that divisiveness. And just kind of on that, going to the question about red lines, I think that, you know, it is absolutely true that a lot of Brexiteers said that they wanted to keep the single market. I think in reality, they would always have to have backed down from that fairly quickly. It was kind of a form of, you know, I mean, it was basically lying. It was cakeism that you can have these things without giving anything up. I don't think in reality they could ever have satisfied what the majority of Leavers wanted, which was that they did not want freedom of movement to continue, and they did not want the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice to continue. And indeed, I mean, the closeness of the result, a better Prime Minister than Theresa May would have realised that the closeness of the result should have prompted a period of, you know, real reflection as to what we wanted as a country, that I think would have come to a much softer Brexit than we did. But by the time we got into this very, very divisive atmosphere, where basically nearly all Remainers just simply wanted a second referendum, and majority of Leavers wanted a pretty hard Brexit. Not all of them, but the majority. And that was what was driving Farage. It was what came to drive the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson. That was why it kind of fell away from that. And in terms of, in terms of what Labour would do now, I think they are, and I think quite rightly, frightened of, those awful headlines that we used to see accusing Theresa May of being a traitor, of, enemies of the people, all of those things, for people who wanted to, what they saw as surrender sovereignty to Brussels. So I think it's a fear of going back into that kind of atmosphere, that kind of division again.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Christabel. Joel, could we come to you to address Elizabeth's question on youth mobility?
Yeah, okay. Youth mobility, I think, reinforces the point I was making before, that you need to think about where the EU is coming from this. Youth mobility wasn't offered out of benevolence or feeling sorry for us. It was offered primarily to manage internal member state interests on the EU side, because the UK had been going around trying to shop a youth mobility deal to Germany, France, Spain, Italy, basically sort of the nice countries that it wants to be able to send, the UK wants to send young people to, but without having to do the same deals with countries where we're likely to take in more people than we send in the other direction. The EU naturally didn't like this, didn't like member states being divided against each other, and so tried to assert control over the situation by saying, here is a package we are putting on the table on behalf of everyone. The EU is negotiating with its own interests in mind, and that is not going to change. In terms of why also Labour said no to it, I think that also speaks to the point about still a lack of real serious strategy about how you actually deliver on this reset. It was obviously boxing itself in by equating a youth mobility agreement with freedom of movement, which is not true. We all know that. And they've made a rod for their own back now, because in order to negotiate with the EU, you need to give youth mobility. It's one of their primary asks. But any deal that you stand up and sign, the opposition are going to say, oh, you called that youth mobility and now you've signed up to it. Labour is signing up to youth mobility. So you've created a political problem, which was done because the response was sort of decided in the short-term general election focus of how do we shut this issue down, not make it a problem during the campaign. But they didn't think about the longer negotiation to come. And fundamentally, that speaks to the fact that this party puts domestic politics before European politics, and that is going to constrain what you're able to do in the next few years.
Thanks very much, Joel. Andy, could we come to you if that's okay? Perhaps to cover that question on how we strengthen the relationship with Europe whilst navigating or respecting the red lines that Labour set out in the manifesto, if that is indeed what we should be doing.
Well, look, I mean, I said earlier, we need to get a new agreement with Europe, and I agree very much with Christabel that, we have a government who, in terms of seats in Parliament, are very strong, but in terms of percentage of the vote aren't. And I don't think that the next 5 years, which is going to be a very, very difficult time, is going to be best served by replaying what was an amazingly divisive and very difficult time for the country. I think Joel's point on the youth mobility process is something that needs to be agreed as part of a bigger deal. Because one thing I have to say about the youth mobility is that the attitudes to youth mobility amongst middle class people is significantly higher than it is a lot of working class people. They're not the ones who are going largely. It's not to say there aren't exceptions, but for a lot of people who voted for Brexit, this is something that they don't want to see in isolation. So I think what we have to do is have a sort of a clear strategy about how we get a new deal. And there's a lot of things we clearly know we want. The other thing I think we do have to recognise, which is a problem that no one really has talked about, is one of the very few things that I consider Margaret Thatcher did well from the point of Britain is get the rebate. And the idea that we're going to get back to Europe and they're going to come back with a rebate is simply not going to happen. So the real danger, if we end up in a Brexit, we're talking about rejoining the EU, it's almost certain that we will get a worse deal than the one we left in when we had the debate. So, but look, we do negotiate trade deals. We have a huge market on our doorstep. We have goods that they want and we have goods that they want. We have supply chains that are integrated. It's very much in our joint interest to come up with a deal. And I think the EU has shown flexibility in terms of other countries. I do recognise the issue that I think it's that they're very keen that Brexit isn't seen as a huge success. And I think from where we are at the moment, they've probably got 5 years evidence that that clearly isn't the case. But we do need to get something better. And I think we have the ability, and if we deal with this constructively, you know, one thing that always amazed me about the EU negotiations was, well, from my point of view, as someone who does have to negotiate, I don't normally stand on a doorstep slagging off the person I'm going to walk into, calling them all the names under the sun, and then expect to get a better deal 10 minutes later. That's not how these things work. So I think there's an opportunity to go in these with a spirit of mutual cooperation, in a spirit of trying to get a win-win, which we actually have a realistic ability to deliver. And if that gets rid of a lot of the customs checks, if that gets rid of a lot of the problems experienced by workers, then there is a clear way forward which should be deliverable. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andy. Alf, if we could come briefly to you for some final response, perhaps on Labour's red lines, or on how we build consensus to get to a kind of a settled future relationship with Europe. Over to you, Alf. Or we may be having challenge getting Alf back in. So do you,
Yes.
in which case, Stella, if I could just come to you for some final comments. I'm particularly interested in, I think, that really good point Danny raised about how do we convince the EU that there is national consensus around whatever agreement we want to get to, so it is durable rather than a kind of hokey cokey in and out and in and out. So how can we build that consensus, Stella?
Yeah, look, I understand the anger and frustration that people are expressing here tonight. You can see the damage that Brexit is doing to our country, and you want to see that damage reversed. The way that you reverse it, because this is not just about the economic or security, it is about the cultural, it is about the division that we have all seen and frankly continue to see about this question, is to not be them. I want to take issue. Some of the people in the comments are doing the same things that the Leavers do. They're trying to find somebody to blame, someone to pin things on, rather than looking for solutions. I make an urgent appeal to all of you that if we are to fight for the future of our country, we have to fight for those solutions. Absolutely, we need a youth mobility deal, but let's be clear, what was being proposed last year wasn't good enough. And frankly, I'm not going to support any youth mobility deal if it doesn't put apprenticeships front and centre, because Andy's right. There are thousands of young people in this country who've had opportunity cut off and do not hear us talking about them. And they are not the young people for whom Erasmus is the scheme they want to support. That doesn't mean Erasmus isn't important. It just means if you want to win this argument, we have to reach out across the country and argue for the things that will make a transformative difference. And linking apprenticeships to youth mobility is one of those things to do. Mickey, you're right to worry about the red lines. I've already said I would stop talking about red lines and start talking about mutual interest, because that's how we get a good negotiating strategy coming forward. But there are reasons to be hopeful. There are reasons to set aside the anger and frustration and be excited about the fact that, frankly, the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, which I will wager nobody else in this call apart from Joel even knew what it was last week before it came up, is now being talked about. Because this is a debate of 2025 and 2026. And I just say to Fabian, with the greatest will in the world, if you're worried about right-wing press barons, worry much more about Elon Musk and his threat of spending £100 million to try and influence British politics. The threat isn't in the traditional media anymore. It is in social media, which is international, interconnected, which is spreading this idea that politics is about finding somebody to blame and rather than finding solutions. The EU was always an imperfect body, but it was a solution about how you could secure cooperation in the wake of the war towards mutual interests. If we want to win the argument for how and why that matters to our shared future, we have to talk about that solution. And it will be in an environment when Musk's money will flood our political debate in one way or another, even if he doesn't fund a political party here in the UK. We cannot keep having the arguments of 2016 and 2019, even if you feel 5 years on that you should have won them then. We will not win them now if we do. but there is an argument for our shared future. There is an argument about what can be achieved in the next 18 months that makes the case for the solutions that working with our colleagues in Europe offers, and therefore offers a much brighter future. I saw somebody in the chat saying, what's the point of the Labour movement for Europe? The point is we are fighting for the future because we're not fighting the battles of the past. And I just appeal to everybody in all of this call, the things that are coming forward, you know, things can only get better, but they can also get worse. If we are not focused on showing the British public that we get it, we get the things that they're frustrated about, and we've got some answers for them, things that will make a meaningful difference to their children's lives, to their jobs, to their communities' lives, well, that's the best answer at all. That's the one that Farage cannot offer. That is the prize that's on offer here. Don't lose sight of the prize that could be on offer because you want to prove that 5 years ago you were right.
Thank you very much, Stella. So we're going to draw things to a close there because we are 3 minutes over, so my apologies as chair. First, I want to thank all of our speakers, so Alf, Christabel, Joel, Andy and Stella. Massive thanks to colleagues at Labour Movement for Europe who helped organise the event today, including particularly Mariana and Sophie for doing the tech, so thank you so much for that. Thank you to Progressive Britain as well for helping organise and promote the event also. At the Fabian Society, we're going to be doing some work this year on building up to the review of the trade and cooperation agreement, setting out how we can have a closer and more constructive relationship with Europe. So if you're interested in helping to shape that and our wider work, we'd very much encourage you to join the Fabian Society, and I've posted a link in the chat. You can also join the Labour Movement for Europe if you want to kind of influence how we progress the relationship with Europe in the future, and also Progressive Britain as well. And there'll be links for all three organisations in the email after this event. So thank you very much for giving up your Thursday evening or some of it to discuss this with us today. We'll put emails of all of us in the chat as well. So if you want to continue the conversation, please do. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.